Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Cyprus Tableau Viz. This month we're having a Christmas special diving into all the IronViz entries. Unfortunately, I don't have anyone to interview me, but I did speak at the Cyprus Tableau User Group to share about my IronViz entry. And I figured it would be great to just refactor that for an episode, so I hope you enjoy it. So today I'm going to talk a little bit on my IronViz entry this year and how I actually came about the idea. When I first saw the theme entertainment, I was really excited because there's so many angles you can take. It can be movies, can be TVs, can be video games. And one of the ideas that I got from my wife was about dark entertainment. The initial ideas that I had was to see how I could get data to raise awareness around the rise of child exploitation. But unfortunately, a lot of this data is really hard to find or kept by federal bureaus that is not accessible to the public. So I kind of ditched the idea because I couldn't find the data for it. The next idea I had was to look at the Data Plus TV dataset and see if I could find an idea. One of the TV shows that I grew up with was Power Rangers. So if anyone knows Power Rangers, you know that Jason David Frank, who plays the Green and the White Ranger, unfortunately passed away a couple of years back, but he was such an instrumental character in my childhood that I wanted to do a tribute to him. But then again, I was thinking between this and child exploitation, it's a little bit dark for entertainment. So I didn't want to go down that route. What I've ended up doing was more of a personal story rather than something that's out in the wild. With this idea, I needed to start with a skeleton, how I'm structuring the entire Viz. And this was this grand idea of me sitting in front of the couch and playing video games. The centerpiece of my Viz would be like a trophy showcase at the back and summary matrix of how much I spent, how many games I played, and the respective playtime hours. The plan was then to stretch it down in a long form infographic that talks about gaming in different phases of my life and ending with a reflection against industrial trends and future. This wasn't too far from my final product, but I needed to refine it a little bit more. The first problem I had was images, and I knew that one of the judging criteria was for design was the limited use of images to replace text. So I visited an idea from my previous life where I dabbled a little bit in video games development. So this is a Pokemon-inspired character sprite sheet that was created by my buddy back when we were a two-man team who wanted to make a game. The first two characters in this sheet is basically me and my best friend. And the initial idea was that I could refactor this and create adaptation of my character for the different sections of my life phase. So I'll probably have a few younger versions of myself in early stages of life. But I also knew that this would take me forever to create, and I only had 1 month. Well, less than that because October was a really busy time for me at work. But that's the thing about IronViz. With the limited time frame, you really got to pick your battles. I knew that data collection would be a much tedious process, so I didn't want to spend too much time on this. I knew that I didn't have time to draw variants of myself. That also meant that I wouldn't have time to draw all the game titles and the trophy showcase. So I started to do a little bit of research to see how I could thematically tie my story to video games. And I kept coming back to the console and TV idea. This is a simplified mood board of what I found early in my brainstorming. I knew I wanted to go pixel art style because of how much of my childhood was forged with those games. So I started to draw my own fonts as well, based on the typography found in some of the older games. But I ended ditching the whole letter vectors because it was too much work. And I went with a readily available free font to save some time. So again, pick your battles. The first major art piece that I did for my Viz was the console. And it was really hard because I went with a perspective view that shows it in a 3D plane rather than a 2D flat surface. So you can see from the left wireframe, each of the shapes were drawn separately, merge, and transform in very precise pixel points. But I also knew that if I couldn't get this to look right, the rest of the Viz would kind of fall flat. So this was really a make or break for me in terms of the thematic design. With a console, I also needed a TV to hook it up with. But thankfully, this is a lot easier. I didn't need to have two perspective drawing because the TV screen could sit in a 2D plane. I did, however, spend a little bit more time adding some textual gradients, shadowing work, and adding a little bit concave curves to make it look a bit more retro. And this ended up being my centerpiece of the Viz. The crazy thing was that I even wanted to draw 5 to 6 different variants of this to represent the gaming console of the years and having the cartridges reflect as much. So you have a assortment of floppy disks, CDs, mini cartridges, and more. But this is also where I put myself back and ask this question: does this image distract or guide your users? Because when you're thinking about user experience, you also have to think about their cognitive load. Are you expecting them to remember too much to understand your Viz? Also, for someone who doesn't play video games, would they even get these subtle references? But yeah, those were my thoughts running through my mind when I was building this. And my decision was to make it more coherent and to make sure that I started and ended the same way, which is why you see a TV screen at the top and at the bottom. What I did was also an additional step to make sure everything tied in thematically was to have the controller wires weave through the different sections of the Viz and end it right next to the final TV screen. Now, before I go ahead and show you the final Viz, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about my intentional designs. One of the experiences I wanted to impart to my audience was the fun of video games, and I achieved it using two methods. The first was having a random function to randomly place the cartridges around the console, kind of imitating how I would have scattered my game disc on the floor when I was a kid. The other fun aspect was to let the audience change the cartridge in the console, because I remember as a kid, that was always exciting when I bought and switched out a new game. Last but not least, I needed a visual feedback to tie everything together. So I played around to add that scrolling animation in. It's heavily inspired by Ant Pulley's microscope Viz on ants, and it did take me quite a while iterating through the different directions and getting animations to work on Tableau Public, because it can get a little iffy when you have complex calculations. But long story short, to do this in Tableau, you need a combination of parameters and calculated fields that re-aggregate your data points, which means you can't do it in the dataset itself. So those probably took about 70 to 80% of completion of my entire Viz. I went through a lot of feedback from other folks in the community, as well as the feedback initiative organized by Sarah Bartlett. And it's really game changing because sometimes when you're too deep in your Viz, you can't really see what doesn't work. So I would recommend for anyone attempting IronViz next year, sign up for that. So I love colors, but I also know that it can be the most distracting thing in a visualization. I made a decision early on to use just one color, which I eventually decided on green because it represents calmness, and that was the emotion I was trying to convey on how video gaming makes me feel. But the problem with one color is I'm very limited in terms of visual hierarchy. So I had to use it very strategically for title callouts and essential takeaways. I also use a heavy emphasis by a green box background to add one more layer of visual hierarchy to my titles. So this plum pulling chart is a bit interesting, and one of the feedback I got early on was the readability of this chart. Since this is a part of my centerpiece, it needed to be right. It took a lot of experimentation, but I introduced a new shape and neutralized the colors to create more contrast. And the one trick that I always use is to stand a distance from your Viz and just squint at it. So if you squint at it and you can still read the charts, then it's good enough. This was another one that I pondered for quite a long time because I wanted to show the separate consoles, but I also show them collectively. But it really boils down to the insight I was trying to bring across, which is the overall numbers. What I ended up doing was not to introduce new colors, but a neutral monochromatic palette and subtly bordered up the bars with green so I can visually connect it back to the big picture. Another stumbling block that I had was making this scatter plot readable because it's the main tool of my storytelling, right? The problem is with scattered plots is that if you don't design them properly, it's really hard to read the density and the distribution of it. When I first started with this particular marginal chart, I was being a bit lazy, so I actually took the yellow star emoji and just put it in the description at the top. The problem with that was that I wanted that to reflect all the green dots in the chart, but it was a different item. So it makes it very hard for people to visually connect both of them. I added the Unicode instead so that I could color the star in green, as well as adding a border for each of the shapes so that it creates that distinction between the different points, and the stars actually pop up a little bit more. The stars actually are tagged as must play by Metacritic, which is a body that does rating for all video games. So all in all, when I'm doing my design, I always think about how I want to bring my audience on a story journey, right? When I started this, you remember the whole skeleton that I had at the top. I needed to refine that. I wanted to start off with a introduction of what video games is, and then just a description of what all of the different phases of my life is. And over here, you have the centerpiece of my visualization. This is the console that I've drawn in Figma. You have all these different cartridges that you can actually click, and it scrolls the TV console. So if you click on the different portion, you can see that the cartridges actually change position. This was the randomness that I added to the x-axis to shift it a little. Basically allows me to add a little bit more fun for my audience. So you can have that scrolling effect. The cartridges actually change whenever you click on a different one. So for example, this is the summary. If you click on this changes to the different cartridges. So that was something fun that I wanted to do. The thematic design of it is that you can see that all of this, you have these wires that go around the different sections. So if I scroll down quickly, you can see it encapsulates the different sections, and finally ending with the controller, which is what you play the video games with, and then the final piece. So I've started off my Viz with the plum pudding chart showing how much time I spent playing game. And I also ended the Viz showing the number of hours I could potentially play games in the future based on the average that I've played in the past. And then we scroll up here, you have all these different pieces that adds additional context to the Viz itself. So I've just used green as my main color throughout my Viz. And as I needed to bring additional focus, I've just changed the color. I've added a green box to add a little bit more weight to it, even for this one. In terms of training my audience to play around and view my visualization a little bit better, what I did here was that I added a little Easter egg. So just saying, guess what happens when you include everything? This is just the outliers, because in my gaming history, what I realized was there is essentially like a good 10 games throughout my life that kind of skews the entire playtime of the whole thing. So if I include it, you can see that I have this one game that I've played for almost a year, 240 days, but it presses all of the other games down. I wanted them to have a feel of what would happen if you exclude and include outliers, so that when you scroll down to the different sections at the bottom, you would know exactly what you need to do when you're interacting with this chart. I intentionally use a scatter plot because I wanted everything to start and end the same way. So over here, you can see that this scatter plot shows all the different phases. You have the birth of the gamer, which is when I was 7 years old, all the way until now, where I'm 40 years old with 2 daughters and stuff like that. And you can see the same structure with the scatter plot. If you scroll to the next section, I've labeled specifically the first 2 phases of my life. This basically zooms in with that specific story for these 2 phases, and you have this same kind of parameter that you can actually switch to exclude or include outliers. This allows them a bit of exploration with the same kind of visual hierarchy that you built in the previous section. If you go down to here, you can see the same thing, but I've excluded the outliers. It brings a different spectrum to the story itself. So you have these 3 different main sections, and I've tried to compress it to each own story so that it's more coherent as you kind of go through the different sections. So that in a nutshell is my IronViz entry beyond the joystick. So I hope you learned something new from this. Thank you everyone for tuning in to this Christmas special, and also a huge thanks to all of my guests who have come on the show to share more about the IronViz entries. And we'll see everyone next year. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas to all. Thank you.